Back to order. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rylund Johnson. I am the MLA for Yellowknife North and chair of this committee. Today's public meeting is review of Speaking Up for Fairness, the 2020-2021 annual report of the Northwest Territories Ombud. On behalf of Standing Committee on Government Operations, I would like to welcome our presenter, the Northwest Territories Ombud, Ms. Colette Langlois. Thank you for providing your annual report and your continued service to the people of the Northwest Territories during what has been a very difficult year for all of us. And due to those COVID outbreaks, we're holding this virtually, but we look forward to once again meeting you in person when it is safe to meet face-to-face again. This meeting is broadcast and can be viewed by tuning into ntassembly.ca or by watching the Assembly's Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter channels. Before we start, I'd just like to remind all members and witnesses that all comments, questions, remarks go through myself as chair and to wait to be recognized before speaking. I will now go ask the members to introduce themselves, starting with the Deputy Chair, MLA Marcellos.
Good morning, MLA Marcellos, member for Tabasco. Welcome, Colette.
And then MLA Semler.
Lisa Semler, MLA for Nunavut Twin Lakes.
We're joined by MLA Cleveland.
Caitlin Cleveland, MLA Cam Lake.
MLA O'Reilly.
Kevin O'Reilly, Friend Lake.
MLA Jacobson.
MLA Nunavut Jackie Jacobson. Hello, Colette.
And MLA Rocky Simpson.
Rocky Simpson, Bay River South.
Awesome. Thank you to all the members, and thank you to Ms. Langlois for joining us here today. Without further ado, I will turn it over to you for any opening comments you may have, and to begin with your presentation to committee.
Hey, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members. And I'll just start by apologizing. I have a very gurgly, noisy heating system going on in the background, so if you're picking that up, I hope it's not too disturbing for members. So I am very pleased to be presenting the 2020-2021 annual report for the Office of the Ombud. This report does represent our first full year in operation, which ended in March 31st, 2021. So we are still quite a new office. I'm very pleased to say, I believe it's as of Monday, we will no longer be the youngest office in Canada because the Prince Edward Islands ombudsperson will be taking over on Monday. They'll have an ombudsperson office for the first time. So we will be the second youngest office in Canada. As you mentioned, it has been a difficult couple of years. COVID-19 very much has been a part of our origin story. The pandemic was declared just a few weeks after we opened. So it's affected the kinds of complaints we've seen, as I'll get into in a little bit in my remarks, and also our operations, of course, as it has everyone else's. And I do share your hope, Mr. Chair, that by the time we do this again, we'll be able to meet in person, because I certainly miss that as well. Just to provide some comments on, I'll begin with our complaints. In terms of numbers, you'll see we had 171 inquiries. That is within the range that I forecast in 2019 when I was planning for the resources the office would need. I was expecting somewhere between 150 and 200 complaints, so it's right in there. We will have similar or perhaps slightly higher numbers for the current fiscal year, so that trend is held. It wasn't just something to do with the opening of the office. I haven't done a scientific comparison of how that compares by population to other jurisdictions, but I have taken a look at it. Yukon tends to range between 100 to 120, and of course their population is somewhat smaller. And I have looked at some of the other provinces just to see how many complaints they're getting by person. Taking into account there's a lot of factors there, and we do compare quite well. We're certainly not way below, and in some cases I think we're actually at quite a higher level than other jurisdictions. So I think that's quite a good early sign. We are getting complaints from across the territory. You'll see in the report there is a larger number in the South Slave in particular, and that's partly I'm sure because the office is in Hay River, but those complaints did come from other centers like Fort Smith and Fort Resolution as well. It is the hub, and people do tend to come here for shopping, and sometimes they would stop in and also see us as well if they're here for another appointment or shopping. So that does collect from the region as well. That is an area where I think you'll see some better numbers from this coming fiscal year. It's not quite so skewed toward the South Slave. We were able to do some more outreach over the last year. We were able to get up to Inuvik. In the summer, there was a tiny little window in there before the Delta outbreak when they had the Great Northern Nights Festival. And as a result, our Beaufort Delta numbers are quite improved. So I think next year's report will look a lot better. The things that would concern me, is if I were seeing 70% of complaints are coming from the capital or 50% of them are coming from just Hay River, then I'm obviously not doing my job to promote this as a territorial office, but we are seeing some good signs that way. Some other good signs I'll point to, we're getting a lot of people that tell us they're referred here from members, which I'm very grateful for. And also from other professionals in the community. So we've had nurses referring people to us, mental health workers, lawyers. So there is some interest in the community, and people are seeing the value of referring people to us. So I take that as a very good sign. And also that some people come back, and they even come back to make a complaint if the first or the second and maybe even the third time their complaint wasn't substantiated, so they didn't get the result they wanted. They still see value in coming back to us, and I also take that as a really positive sign. So how we do our work, I highlight in the report, listening is really important. Sometimes we're the first person that they've talked to that's actually taken the time to listen to their story from beginning to end. And that's to me is a service, even if at the end of the day we're not able to help them address their concern. We also help people by navigating. So that's partly just pointing them in the right direction. And you see that, I think, in example one of the reports, somebody called with a concern about an insurance company, which is way outside of our mandate. They're not a government service, but we're still able to point them to another agency that might be able to help them with that. It also includes, it's not always just telling people, yeah, we can't help you, you need to call this person, or you could try and see if this office can help you. It also includes providing some coaching and support for how to take a concern forward, because sometimes people aren't quite sure how to approach an appeal process, or maybe there isn't a formal complaint process, but there's somebody in the organization they could talk to, and we do help them out with that, just to coach them a little bit. If they're not sure what to say or who to talk to, we do help with that. And I think the example for, the person that had a concern with their child's school was a good example of that. One thing I think we do quite well is parsing out when somebody has a whole long list of concerns. There's a situation that might involve a lot of different agencies. We're pretty good at parsing out what are things that we might be able to deal with from our office, and what are some things where a referral might be appropriate. Because people often don't come, and I'm sure you see this as members too, they don't necessarily have a nicely packaged, really clear complaint that's clearly a procedural fairness issue, or clearly that. So I think we've gotten quite good at that. And you may see from, if you had a look at the quotes in the report of people that used our office, that those things have been really helpful for them in a lot of cases. So those are the concerns, those are often ones that get referred, or we send the person back to the authority or the department to solve it. Of course, there are some complaints where we need to do some more active intervention, some problem solving. And what that looks like when we're doing our informal early resolution process. Sometimes it can be raising the concern with the agency immediately if there's an issue that's pressing. So an example of that would be the person who called us with a concern that COVID protocols for cleaning weren't being followed in an area and in a correctional center. So that's a call to the warden. We deal quite frequently with corrections, so we have all kinds of protocols and channels set up to get these things resolved quickly. So I'm sure members can see that's not the same as a formal investigation. It's just that gets solved in a quick phone call. Here's the concern. Please let us know what you do about it, and if we need to, we'll get back to the complainant and let them know you've dealt with it. Also, facilitating information exchange really helps. Sometimes just trust is broken down to the point where the complainant isn't really going to want to listen to anything the authority has to say, even though they're genuinely trying to help. So we can sometimes do a bit of shuttle diplomacy and help pass the information back and forth. Example 5 is an example of that. There was some confidential information, they wouldn't have been able to share with the complainant for privacy reasons for third parties. But we were able to take a look at it and then assure the complainant, yes, they did follow their policy and they've met all the requirements. So there isn't a complaint, or there isn't an unfairness concern there. Sometimes it does go beyond that into more of a negotiation with the authority. Have you considered this, or could you look at this, or is this something that might work? And then, of course, we do, and these are the minority of complaints that get to the formal investigation stage, and that's where we're interviewing witnesses, gathering documents, asking for a lot more detailed information. In terms of the kinds of complaints we're getting, complaint topics, a lot of them are procedural fairness issues, sometimes decision fairness, and that tends to be things like just a policy isn't very clear, and we might ask them to do some wordsmithing to make it so everybody understands how it's supposed to work. And to me, those are kind of low hanging fruit, because there's often a really clear principle that we can apply to them. The ones that are trickier is what we call fair service, or sometimes relational fairness, and that has to do with, as it sounds like, relationships between authorities and clients, keeping in mind, that there is, depending on the program, it can be greater or less, but there's always a power imbalance there when somebody's dealing with government. That can be things like, they may have followed all the proper processes, but, is the information in plain language? Is the tone, does it sound like they care, or does it sound, really cold and bureaucratic? And even though everything else is done properly, that might set some people off. And what's the accessibility from the point of view of the client, not necessarily the point of view of the authority. So they may see that their processes are easy for people to access, but from the client's perspective, that process might be a lot more difficult. A couple of other clusters that I noted in the report, we do get a lot of calls about hiring decisions. So generally we refer people to staffing appeals. That's the appropriate process, but there are some people that don't have appeal rights, and there are sometimes misunderstandings. And they think that sometimes people think there's a pattern going on because they keep getting refused for a number of jobs, not just a particular competition. So there's an example of that in the report where we were able to look into that. And of course, COVID-19 and the restrictions that went along with that did generate a number of complaints. And I just want to be clear, that's not just about the Department of Health or the public health orders. That there were workplaces. Authorities are also workplaces. There were also other areas. Of course, the whole government was touched by that. So it wasn't necessarily strictly about the health department. The majority of those came in right at the beginning, I would say May and June 2020, and I think that was a time when the public health orders were quite new. There were later revisions of those orders that made some things clearer. I do really want to acknowledge the cooperation and receptiveness of particularly the Department of Health and the health authorities and the COVID secretariat in working with us to deal with some of those procedural issues. There are a couple of examples in the report of that. As ombuds within Canada and also within the International Ombudsman Institute, which we formally became a part of in the fiscal year we're reporting on as well, we had a lot of conversations about how to handle this, because of course it's a new situation for us. We don't want to get in the way of a public health emergency response and the ability of government to deal with the situation. But we also still have to speak up for fairness. Procedural fairness doesn't go away, because we're in an emergency. That's still really important. Arguably, it's even more important in a situation like that. So it was certainly something, a balance we were trying to strike, and we have been trying to strike. And there was certainly a lot of internal discussion amongst ombuds going on around that. It's not, I wasn't navigating this on my own. So that's all I wanted to say about complaints. I'll just say a little bit about our education and outreach mandate. Of course, the pandemic has really curtailed what we could do with that, and particularly any kind of in-person presentations and visits. In 2021, we did a lot of, we were quite aggressive with advertising. We did a lot of radio ads, Facebook ads. We distributed over 2,000 pamphlets. We did get quite a bit of traffic on our website, which seems to be working quite well. But in-person is still really important. There's just nothing that substitutes for some people. If they don't know who's going to be picking up the phone, if it's not somebody they've met or seen, hearing an ad just isn't going to make them comfortable contacting the office. For some people, it's fine. For others, it's an obstacle for them. It's a barrier. Also, the nice thing about in person is, when we run ads, say on the radio, somebody hears the ad or sees it on Facebook. If they have a particular concern in mind, they might think, okay, yeah, I'm going to call the office right away. But it's often the case that, it's 3 months down the road when something comes up, and by then they've forgotten about the ad. So the nice thing with the in-person is we can hand out pens, we can hand out mugs, shopping bags and things. We have a few little promotional items, and then people have them in their house. So if something, or in their purse, so if something comes up a few months down the road, they might see the number. And in fact, exactly that happened a couple of weeks ago. We had someone call from a small community in the Beaufort Delta who had said, hey, you know what, I would never have thought to call you, except you guys were up in Inuvik and I saw you and I got one of your pens and I hope you can help. So these things really do work. I don't want to, I can't emphasize how important that is. And I really hope we'll be able to get out and do more of that in the coming year. It's also one thing that's really helping with the promotion of the office is that now that we've got a couple of years behind us, there's stories that we can tell about how these principles work, because I know when I was promoting the office at the beginning, it was really hard to get across to people. These are really abstract principles, things like procedural fairness and decision fairness, and it's really hard for people to connect that with their experience. But now we have some stories, so we can give examples, and that's why we put the effort into to put some of those in our annual reports, because it gives people an idea of what we can do beyond investigations. Part of the education and outreach is also building relationships in the public service. So we did do a number of presentations. Those are listed in the report, often to senior management teams to let them know who we are and what we're about. One area where we haven't gotten as far as I would have hoped we would have by now is developing some formal training for the public service. So there is a little 1-hour webinar called Fairness 101 that's available that public service employees can take. We're borrowing that from the BC Ombudsperson's office. It's not something we developed internally, but we are working on getting some training going. It's partly because we do have to prioritize dealing with complaints, but that work is going on in the background, and I hope we'll be able to start delivering that in the fall. I really do think and this is a harder thing to quantify with statistics or numbers in a report, but one of the things I said when I applied for this position and I was interviewed by the board in the previous assembly was that if I'm the only person who's speaking up for fairness, this is not going to succeed. We really need to have champions within the authorities. And I'm really seeing that, and it's at all levels of the organization. It's at the executive leadership, and also, there are a lot of program managers and a lot of directors who really get this stuff, and they are speaking up for it internally. I think they see us as allies, especially if they're in lower management positions. Sometimes it's hard to get the attention of their higher ups, and in senior management, sometimes it's hard to communicate to staff why these things are important. So when they have a letter from us with some suggestions or a report with some recommendations, it can really help them with things that they're already trying to do. I often tell departments, look, please, I'm a free consultant. Look at me that way, because I'm here to try and help you do your work in a way that's more fair, and that makes that easier for your employees as well. So, Mr. Chair, that was all I had for opening comments. I'll just close by thanking you again for making the time to speak with me, and saying again how much I hope that we can do this in person next time. Thank you, and I look forward to questions from you and from members.
Thank you, Ms. Langlois. And on behalf of committee and, really all the residents in NW, thank you for your work. I know we see many of the similar files, and we work from both ends to try and bring procedural fairness to all of the authorities that we have oversight with. With that, I will open up for any questions or comments from committee members, beginning with MLA Rylund.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to Ms. Langlois for her presentation here this morning. My first question actually relates to COVID-19, and I'm wondering if the Ombud can speak to the impact of COVID-19 in carrying out her mandate, but also I'm wondering if there is an intent from the office to put together almost experiences through COVID or lessons learned through COVID of the GNWT and procedural fairness throughout the state of emergency. Thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Langlois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. So to speak to the, whether there's an intent to look at lessons learned, that I hadn't thought of doing something specifically on the COVID situation. I am seeing numbers drop off quite a bit for COVID complaints. Most of them, as I said, did come in earlier last year, and this fiscal year, there's only a small handful. I think it's something that we're going to be talking about collectively as ombuds across the country, and it may be something that we do jointly as a document. Other than that, I think, the report, the annual report, it will certainly be a topic in this year's annual report as well. And I think that will summarize the issues that we've seen with COVID. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any follow-up, MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I guess I look forward to seeing that and seeing how it's had an impact on our different statutory offices, and I think people are really interested in kind of the lessons learned as to how government organizations across the nation really have handled COVID-19, and to not lose kind of the insight that we have today for future potential pandemics, really. My next question is in regards to the last annual report that committee received from 1920 that made recommendations for changes to the Ombud Act. Several of these were not repeated in this version of the annual report, and I'm wondering if the Ombud can speak to whether or not those recommendations still hold, or if an additional year with the office has changed those recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Langlois.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. And first I'll say I realize I didn't respond to the first part of the member's first question about how COVID affected the operations of the office. So maybe I'll just mention that first of all. So, as I said, it's part of our origin story. We had to shift to remote operation within a few weeks of opening. I think it was really minimal disruption to our ability to receive complaints, particularly from across the territory, because most people wouldn't be able to come into the office in person anyway. So, people were able to leave voicemail messages on our phones. We were checking those a couple of times a day. We also receive a lot of complaints, not the majority, but probably close to half by email. So that was something that we were able to monitor carefully. We had, I had set up the office to be able to function somewhat remotely in any case, because for a very different reason. I had expected I would be doing a lot of traveling within the territory to promote the office and to do investigation work. And I was concerned that, if we were all out doing these things, there wouldn't be a way to keep the office going, because I thought, we have a small staff, and I was concerned for that reason. It would be helpful to be able to make sure we could all log in remotely and do these things remotely, check voicemail and connect into our system. So in a way, we were kind of set up for that already. Everybody already had cell phones, and so we were able to make that work pretty quickly within a few days, actually. Just the time it took for staff to get their equipment home. So to the question of last year's annual report and the recommendations, so the recommendations aren't repeated in the 2021 annual report, partly because I was still awaiting, when I wrote that, the committee's response and also the government's response to the committee's report. So I didn't have the it didn't seem appropriate to just repeat the recommendations, knowing that they were still under consideration. Apart from a couple of changes that I would probably make based on the comments from the committee and the government, the recommendations really haven't changed. My thought is I don't know that I need to repeat them every year. I will certainly repeat them before the end of my mandate to make sure that they're still on record. I don't have any new recommendations. I would just highlight, I guess, there is some reference, at least in the government's response, and I can't recall in the committee's report as well, to looking at best practices. And I do want to assure members, I did that certainly from the perspective of ombuds offices, and I know governments might have different perspectives on this, but I did my homework. I didn't just do this on my own. I did talk to senior officials in other ombuds offices, their internal legal counsel. Some of them have been there for decades. So they were certainly able to explain the meaning of some provisions and how they apply them, because they're very similar across jurisdictions. It's, I guess the process is, it's difficult to know how much detail to put into an annual report. I recognize this is a public document. People aren't going to want to read pages and pages and pages about why the legal technicalities of why an amendment might be appropriate or not. So I did keep it to a fairly high level, but certainly, in future, if committee does want a more detailed briefing than what I put in the annual report, or if they want their staff to connect with me, and also, if the government wants their staff to connect, I'm certainly open to doing that, because I realize, without seeing the operation, it can be difficult in the abstract to try and understand how these things work. So yes, I will repeat the recommendations at some point, possibly not in the coming annual report, but certainly before the end of my term. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Langlois. And I suspect committee might repeat some of their recommendations as well. So I think it's likely we'll have some further conversations with you and the department, and hopefully get a piece of legislation at some time in the future. I'll open it up to any further questions from committee. Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to compliment the Ombud on the report. I think it's a really helpful model in terms of it being plain language. You compile some statistics so that we can track trends, I think, over a number of years. And I know you've only been in place a couple of years, but it's a really good kind of template, I think, for even some of the other statutory officers in terms of what they do. But I just want to follow up a little bit more on the recommendations from your last report. I think it's fair to say that committee accepted most, if not all, of the recommendations you made, and it won't be a surprise that some of those actually came up during the review of the original bill, such as the ability to look back in time and having a clear mandate to deal with implementation of GNWT policies and so on. The response that we got from Cabinet, though, was, I think I'll try to be diplomatic, less than enthusiastic. They basically said for some of them, well, we'll look at them when we get around to reviewing the bill the next time. Well, and if it's anything like the ATIP legislation, that only took 20 years. So I don't want to wait that long. But I'm wondering if you've had a chance to look at the government responses, and if you have any, say, priorities amongst the changes that you've recommended, or any other things you'd like to say about the original set of recommendations you made. Look, I think they're well researched, they were well founded. I accept your best practices argument, and I can see you're well connected in the community across Canada and around the world with Ombud functions around the world. This is great, but our government cabinet was, as I say, way less than enthusiastic in accepting them. I don't accept that, and I'm going to push them, but I'd like to hear if you have anything further you want to add to those recommendations. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Go ahead, Ms. Langlois.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question as well. In terms of priorities with the recommendations, I think probably the highest priority would be the ones that affect our jurisdiction, because that's what's really impacting the public, right? It's particularly when they can't make complaints. Somebody in Fort McPherson, I think it's a housing association there, has exactly the same issue as somebody in Yellowknife, but I can only take the Yellowknife complaint because that housing authority is in jurisdiction of the office and the other one isn't. And really it would be probably the same type of conversation that we need to have. A lot of uncertainty about certain offices and whether they would come under our jurisdiction or not, or in some cases I've had legal opinions they don't, like for example the rental office, which I've heard concerns about. I don't know if they're substantiated. I don't want to be unfair to the rental office, but we can't ask the question, right? And that's just one example. There are other examples as well. And that really is an outlier in terms of legislation across Canada. Everybody else has a broader provision similar to Yukon. We're really the only ones that do that. The pre-2016, you've seen in a couple of special reports that I put out earlier this year on investigations, and there's a couple others where this has been an issue. yeah, I April 199 as opposed to going back forever. I understand that because, of course, we don't want to take over suddenly jurisdiction of Nunavut from prior to 1999. I think that the concern that it could open the floodgates and lead to too many complaints is not one I have. The Act gives me a lot of ways to say no to complaints if they're not things that I could do anything about. And that is almost always the case with older complaints. Even now, going back to 2016 and 2017, I had a bad interaction with, a frontline worker in this department 3 years ago. I can't really investigate that anymore. People aren't going to remember. The staff person might not even be there. But in a few cases where there is a documentary trail, like there is with any kind of, financial transaction, a sale of property, a loan, those are things that we can track and look back to the past. And, it has been, some clients have found it, I guess, really difficult to accept that we haven't been able to. In some jurisdictions, there is no time limit on how far the Ombud can go back. And I don't have the resources to do this. Sometime in the future, it might be something that an Ombud would want to do. But they have gone back sometimes and looked at historical issues just as kind of a closure thing to say, what happened way back when those decades ago was really unfair. And, we want to say this and make a statement about this. So I think BC did one on the Doukhobor children, for example. That's a long time ago, but still, they were able to look at that. So I think, in terms of priorities, it's really about the ones that affect clients that I would be the most concerned about. The other ones I put in there, I mean, they're gray areas. I like to clean those up when we can because, we don't want to get embroiled in a bunch of judicial reviews like other offices have in the past, particularly when things have been settled or there's a practice in place in other jurisdictions. So it's about avoiding that, but they're things generally we can manage around. I put them in there because I thought, well, if they're going to go open up the Act possibly and look at jurisdictional issues, we might as well put everything in there that might improve the Act. Those two would be my priority, I would say, with the jurisdiction. The only other one that I might ask be considered, and I believe the committee wasn't in support of this one, but it was a provision for authorities and their staff to be able to voluntarily give us information, even if we're not in a formal investigation. And the reason why that can be important is there's often a lot of back and forth between us and the authority before we even get into a formal early resolution process or an investigation, just to figure out if there's actually an issue. We call that complaint assessment. And it doesn't necessarily fall under the umbrella of what would be considered an investigation, because I won't necessarily have given formal notice to the authority yet. We're just trying to get some information to figure out if there's even an issue to know if we need to do something about it. I note that provision, it's in Saskatchewan. It kind of fits, it goes along with the provision we have in the Northwest Territories legislation about informal non-adversarial resolution processes. I note they also put that provision in the Prince Edward Island legislation. So that would be the other priority. And that's really to help us facilitate those relationships with authorities and just to be able to give some comfort, particularly to frontline staff, who are sometimes really uncomfortable dealing with our office. It hasn't been so much a problem with senior management, but just to reassure them that, they're doing the right thing and it's okay to talk to us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up, Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I really appreciate the Ombud's response there. One other area, you mentioned that a number of your complaints have to do with GNWT staffing, and as a regular MLA, I can tell you that I get a number of those complaints myself. And in the last assembly, we did look at staffing, and the grounds for appeals to be successful are so narrow that it really makes very few people can even access the appeal system, let alone have any success there. So have you given any thought to looking using your authority to look at procedural fairness with regard to the staffing appeals in general? Because I think you have that ability to carry out systemic looks. And of course, we, as of January, end of January, we have the ability to even ask you to do things or suggest that you do look at something. Anyways, just wondering if you have thought about that as an area that might benefit from your review. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Langlois?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So staffing appeal officers are actually one of the kinds of authorities that I've been advised I don't have jurisdiction to look into because they're not part of the department, right? They're engaged as outside. So I can't look directly at the staffing appeals. All I would really be able to look at is the policy framework around how the staffing appeals have to be conducted, and that's probably not something that would get at the questions the member is looking at. I will say though that some of the complaints I get about the staffing process, they're really more concerned about the policies. So there's a lot of concerns about the priority hiring policy, and those are ones that I don't take on. I have to tell, and I see, there's some announcements this week. There are some changes coming to that, I think, but those are the ones where I tell them, look, that's a policy issue. Like that's not something we can deal with. It's actually the policy that you're unhappy with. I've seen this with the business incentive policy as well. Those are policy issues. So the place to take that is to your MLA, or if the government's doing consultation processes on that to participate in those. So even though we identify those as hiring, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a complaint that we've been able to take on. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions from committee?
Chair?
Go ahead, Emily Martellus.
When you talked about the policy framework of hiring, I'm just wondering about also, have you looked or able to look at the advertising of these positions? Because many times the positions are done in-house, or they already know the outcome of the position with the manager already knows that. And this is we never touched on this when we're talking about retention and recruitment of Indigenous staff and P1s and P2s. But a lot of these positions are done in-house, and none of them they don't go out for advertising. They are given to the person that sometimes is less qualified than the person that's interested in, and they never have a chance at getting that job. So the whole policy framework on government hiring is. Have you looked at all that, or you haven't, or has anybody asked you to do that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily Martellus. Ms. Langlois?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I can't recall if this would have happened in 2021 or it might have been in current year, but we've certainly had concerns raised about just those scenarios you mentioned. So, a competition is advertised as in-house only. Sometimes it's advertised in a particular location, and then the person ends up getting staffed and they're in a different location. So there are some concerns about how those go out. So we do follow up with them. But again, it's more of a policy matter. That's whether they decide, because these things are all according to HR policies. They're allowed to do this. They are allowed to staff internally. They are allowed to put some restrictions on staffing in certain situations. So if they're following a policy that's there, I can't, unless the policy is really unclear or really unfair in itself, which I can't say it is. This is a discretion that has been given to managers and how they do that. I can't really look into that. It's really a decision for policymakers to make. And if they're following the policies and the policies are clear, it's not a matter of administration for me that I would be able to look at. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Langlois. Any follow-up, Emily Martellus?
No, I'll bring it up when we have the finance minister in front of us. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions from committee members?
Rocky.
Go ahead, Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the presentation. One area, I guess, one concern here or thing I'd like to bring up is that, when it comes to staff there, it's important that you know your client and you've got to be able to communicate effectively. And I find that to be an issue with some GNWT staff. And I get that, I guess, when I have constituents come in here. And, and I guess in part it's due to, matter of privacy and the staff not understanding how far they have, they can go with providing the information or just not understanding processes. So, and also understanding, what, administrative fairness is as well. And I noticed on there that there is that course or that presentation there, webinar, put on, I guess, by the BC government, Fairness 101. Is that something that you've actually recommended that all GNWT employees take, or is it something that that you could recommend if you have it? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Simpson. Go ahead, Ms. Langlois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so every time I do a presentation, I, to senior management teams, I talk about that webinar, Fairness by Design, and I recommend it. And every time I do that, I do see an uptick in how many people take it. And I thank you. Thanks to the member for his comment. It is something I've considered, is actually recommending that the GNWT include it maybe as part of their employee onboarding. I wanted to give it a year or so to see whether, if I was getting any feedback that it wasn't a useful training, maybe we wouldn't do that. But I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I think we're probably at the point now where we could make that recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Emily Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, and I thank you for that as well, because I think that sometimes government employees and we as politicians as well, we tend to forget that we're here to represent the people of the NWT, and that's the bottom line. So we've got to listen, we've got to be able to communicate with them, and do all that in a timely manner. Because when they come with issues, no matter how big or small, they should all be big to us. So I'm glad to hear that, that something like this could be recommended, and hopefully they would take it. But the second point I want to make is that of all the complaints, I guess, that you've received to date, can you give me an idea of, what's the average time to, between opening and closing a file, and what would be the longest file that you've had open, and what would be the circumstances around that? Thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Langlois.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we do track that. I don't report it because I'm not sure it's actually a useful statistic to just get an average, because we have complaints that get closed, within the same day or even within the hour quite easily. The longest file I have going on right now is an investigation, and it's almost 2 years now since the person made the complaint, and we're getting very close to closing that one. That's really not an acceptable amount of time for me. It's something that happened because we had a number of big investigation files right after the office opened that we had to get going all at once. And they, we had to learn a lot about procedures and processes. So if we had that same complaint today, it would happen a lot more quickly. So, I have apologized to the complainant for that. And once we have the final report, I will be apologizing again, because that's definitely not something we want to see again. And I don't think it'll happen again, because we're getting complaints come in more evenly now. It's not a big cluster at the beginning. But that is something I'm aware of, and it's certainly a concern for me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Langlois. Any further questions from committee? Hearing none, Ms. Langlois, just on behalf of committee, we'd like to thank you for all of your work, and to any members of the public watching, we highly encourage you to use the Ombud services. It was a long battle for the NWT to get its Ombud, and I think we are all very grateful for the work you're doing, and the changes we're seeing in GNWT culture as a result. So I'll turn it over to you for any closing remarks.
Okay, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members for all your questions and comments, and I'll certainly look forward to the committee's report and to our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who tuned in for today's public hearing. I will now end the live stream, and thank you very much again, Ms. Langlois, and I'll ask members to hang on the line for a wrap-up discussion.